French President Emmanuel Macron affirms support for a West African counterterrorism force. How ongoing violence in the Central African Republic is threatening the animals at a protected wildlife reserve. And the music world claps back at Kylie and Kendall Jenner's controversial line of t-shirts. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening, I'm Lina Moudouen for Vincent Macquarie. This is Africa 54. And French President Emmanuel Macron has announced military and financial support to a group of countries fighting terrorism in Africa's Sahel region. Macron was in Mali on Sunday to consolidate Western backing for a five-nation regional force against the militants. During his visit, an al-Qaeda-affiliated group based in Mali released a video of 6 foreign hostages it is holding for ransom. VOA's Latika Hoke reports.
Macron called for a united effort to eradicate terrorism, warning against calling it a war.
And I would not talk of a war as such, because that is what they want. And for that, you would require an enemy worthy of the name. But every day, we face terrorists, thugs, murderers, whose names and faces we must forget, but whom we must steadfastly and with determination eradicate altogether.
Macron said his country will provide operational and combat support for the anti-insurgent forces in the region, including 70 tactical military vehicles, communication kits, and protection equipment for the soldiers.
From now on, the Sahel represents 50% of our security and defense cooperation budget in the world, because here is where the security of the continent of Africa is being contested. Entire planet, Europe included.
Mali is hosting a summit with Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania, known as the G5 Sahel. The heads of state of those 5 countries launched a regional force Sunday that will deploy thousands of troops into the vast, arid areas of the Sahel that serve as a breeding ground for insurgent groups considered to be a threat to Europe.
Our countries are now theaters in which to hide weapons of all kinds, a haven for foreign fighters, terrorists running away from the international operations in Syria, as well as binationals transiting through our region, trying to get to Europe.
Terrorist groups in the region resort to trafficking and kidnapping for ransom to support themselves. On Sunday, a terrorist group in Mali released a video of 6 hostages it has been holding for ransom. 3 of them are women. Last week, Sweden announced the release of Johan Gustafsson, who was held by Islamic extremists in Mali for 6 years. But many governments refuse to pay ransom to discourage more kidnapping in the future. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
The carnage in war-torn Syria continued on Sunday. An explosion in Syria's capital killed at least 8 people and wounded a dozen more. Syrian state television reported that a suicide bomber in a car blew himself up in Tahrir Square in central Damascus. Footage on state television showed at least 2 scorched vehicles and other debris along the road to the airport. Syrian security forces say they had pursued 3 car bombers, destroying 2 at the entrance to the city before they could do damage. The 3rd driver initially evaded authorities and blew himself up in Tahrir Square after being surrounded. Now, Saudi Arabia and its allies involved in a diplomatic dispute with Qatar said Monday they would extend by 48 hours a deadline for the Gulf nation to comply with their demands. Kuwait, which has been trying to negotiate a peaceful end to the Gulf Arab states' blockade of Qatar, asked for the deadline extension Sunday, shortly before the deadline. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt severed diplomatic and commercial links with Qatar on June 5th, accusing the government in Doha of supporting terrorism in an alliance with Iran. Qatar has denounced the charges as baseless. The foreign minister of Qatar, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman, says the demands by the Saudis and their partners, including the closure of Qatari state-owned Al Jazeera News Group, would sacrifice Qatar's sovereignty. And U.S. President Donald Trump discussed the situation by phone in separate calls Sunday with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. A White House statement says Mr. Trump addressed his concerns about the dispute and also stressed the importance of regional unity, stopping terrorism financing, and discrediting extremist ideology. Now, the United States trade relationship with Sub-Saharan Africa was discussed recently here in Washington, D.C. during the 11th Biennial U.S.-Africa Business Summit. The high-level gathering was an opportunity for participants, including businesses, government representatives, and private sector, to discuss, among other things, the current state of business between the United States and Africa, and attempt to define the new U.S. administration's engagement in Africa. Currently, about 1.5% of U.S. exports are to Sub-Saharan Africa, and observers say more opportunities remain to be explored to benefit American businesses and investors, as well as their African counterparts. Joining us in the studio for Perspective is Floriza Leiser, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa and former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa. Ms. Leiser, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Lenore.
First off, tell us about the work of the Corporate Council on Africa in the vast landscape of doing business in Africa and what from the summit.
So first of all, thank you for having me again. The Corporate Council on Africa is a premier U.S. business association. We're a nonprofit that has been in place since 1993. And our premier purpose is to focus on improving the relationship and growing the relationship between U.S. and African businesses. We have this 11th U.S.-Africa Biennial Summit, the U.S.-Africa Business Summit, several weeks ago. And we were really delighted that we had almost 800 registrants, and we're really fortunate to have some very high-level participants, including President Nyusi of Mozambique, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, and the President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Adesina, amongst many others.
So what transpired when we look at the landscape? You know, a lot of people say that doing business between Africa and the United States can be improved. It's not where it should be. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the challenges and perhaps new opportunities that were able to transpire?
So I think that in the past, there were a number of barriers, I think, to improving the business environment in Africa. But many changes have been made. A vast majority of African countries, if you look at the World Bank Doing Business report, now have experienced improvements in the business environment, including how quickly one can get licenses to operate, and the general rule of law has really improved in Africa. So some of what we're seeing in Africa between the U.S. and African businesses is the fact that people may still have an old impression of the African market. But truthfully, there are thousands of companies that are already operating in Africa and know that really it's a tremendous opportunity for them. U.S. businesses are not in Africa just to do good. They're really in Africa to do well. And like companies from all around the world, whether it is China, which everyone talks about, but also countries from Europe, Malaysia, Brazil, India, all over the world are in Africa for the same reason that U.S. companies are there. It is because they have one of the highest rates of return on investment, and they are also the second most popular destination for foreign direct investment.
So how can African businesses be more appealing to the American market so that they are able to bring more goods and services in this country?
Well, the reason that we don't have quite as much in terms of exports from Africa into the U.S. is because the nature of African trade with the United States and really with the rest of the world is still evolving. For a long time, Africans have really been producing raw commodities, shipping them out to other countries, including the United States, where those products are processed and value is added. Now, what we find is that the capacity in Africa to trade and to actually process its own raw commodities and materials, Africa is clearly very rich in them, and the ability to take those products and process them into more value-added products, ship them to the rest of the world, is indeed happening already. So whereas maybe 20 years ago, you really did not see Africa shipping, for example, apparel to the rest of the world, or footwear to the rest of the world, or televisions to the rest of the world. Now what you're seeing is that Africans are indeed doing that. Companies there are able to be competitive vis-a-vis companies from all around the world. So for the United States, we have already seen probably about a tripling of African exports of non-oil commodities to the U.S. under the African Growth and Opportunity Act since 2000, when that law was first put in place. Obviously, there's much more room for growth and much more room for diversification of African economies. Many African countries are focused on industrialization and diversification.
And very quickly, you went from being the U.S. trade representative for Africa to the private sector. How do you make that shift?
Well, you know, I'm really fortunate because we're still working on a lot of the things that I've been working on for many years, which is how do you improve and grow the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship. I was working on it in the government as the Assistant USTR for Africa, and I'm working on that same thing now. Also, the number of the people, the relationships that I've had over the years, many of them are the same.
Ms. Lizer, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that was Florizel Lizer. She's President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. Now, officials in the Democratic Republic of Congo are breathing a sigh of relief after declaring its 2-month Ebola outbreak officially over on Saturday, after 42 days without recording a new case of the disease. The outbreak in Congo's remote northeastern forests was a record 8 for the country, where the disease was first discovered in 1976. The nation's health minister says the disease killed 4 out of the 8 people infected. Congo health officials say northeastern Congo's remote geography, combined with the country's experience fighting the disease, allowed them to quickly control the outbreak. A protected reserve in the southwestern region of the Central African Republic is home to various species of wild animals, and it was once a major tourist attraction, but it's now vulnerable due to the ongoing conflict in the country. VOA's Caroline Turner has more.
At the Dzanga Park, elephants drink water and play in the mud. It is not an unusual sight in these parts of the Central African Republic, even though the country has been embroiled in conflict for the last 4 years. The park is located in Bayanga, a town over 500 kilometers southwest of the capital, Bangui. It is a protected reserve and home to 3,400 forest elephants, who are smaller than their cousins on the African savanna. Gorillas, chimpanzees, and other wildlife also call it home. Run by the government with financial and technical support from the World Wildlife Federation, the UNESCO World Heritage Site was once teeming with tourists. One of the park's main attractions was the primate habituation program, attracting over 500 tourists a year.
In order to see the elephants, we group all the tourists together here at the welcoming section, and then we give them information and brief them on what they can and cannot do while hiking. We also brief them on the activities we will be doing and what to expect when we are in the forest.
Doli Lodge, the park's main accommodation facility, now lies idle and is struggling to attract visitors. The CAR has been in turmoil since rebels charged the capital and ousted President Francois Bozize in 2013. After the Dzanga area was looted 3 times in 1 month, the World Wildlife Fund pulled out its staff.
We are very safe here. Unfortunately, after the war and even before the war, there was a lot of security warnings, but the trouble has never really affected the southern part of the country, but it affected tourists badly. Tourism was very badly affected. We went through a very bad phase of no tourists, only journalists who came here to see the wonderful sort of place that we are. But now we are working very hard at marketing, and it is safe. There is no reason to believe that we get trouble here.
Many of Bayango's residents are dependent on tourism. They sell supplies and artifacts to visitors and work in the park and its lodges. Conservationists say poachers took advantage of the chaos to hunt down animals in protected wildlife areas and openly sell their meat in village markets. But today, economic activity here is low and opportunities are scarce.
I want to see more people coming to Bayanga, because it's a rich town, really rich. More tourists need to come, and residents need to change their ways and stop killing animals so that tourists can come and see them, and for the state to also benefit from tourism revenues.
Recent fighting between militia groups has killed about 300 people and displaced nearly 100,000 in the last month, so tourists are unlikely to return anytime soon. Carolyn Turner, VOA News, Washington.
We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Find me on Twitter @LenorMoudou. Coming up, bridging culture through movies at the Africa Film Festival in Dallas, Texas. Stay with us.
My name's Carla Babb, and I work the Pentagon beat. That access helps me to do better stories. Every day it's my responsibility to collect all of the defense news. It keeps our VOA viewers informed. I get to travel all across the globe. Anything that's defense related and how to protect and keep people safe, that's where I'll go. So it's never a dull moment at the Pentagon. My name is Carla Babb. This is my beat.
On Tuesday, July 4th, America celebrates its 1776 independence from Britain. And over this holiday weekend, well, independent films from across Africa are being screened in Dallas, Texas, where the African Film Festival is taking place. Organizers of the event hope to show African stories to a non-African audience with the aim of bridging cultures through films. For more insight on this event, VOA's Henak Fenty is standing by live in Dallas, Texas. Hello, Henak.
Hello from beautiful, sunny Dallas, Texas. How are you, Lenore?
Very good. How are you? Enjoying the sun?
Enjoying the film, and this is also the barbecue capital of the U.S. And this being July 4th weekend, it's just fantastic. Here at the Africa Film Festival, stories from across Africa, about 40 films are being screened here from 25 different African countries. These are stories that are being told by Africans about Africa, everyday life, challenges, opportunities, hopes and dreams being produced in Africa by Africans. There's also 8 entries in this film festival. Stories about Africa, the African diaspora and African Americans. These are stories being told by non-Africans, and it's through these links that they're creating that they want to tell the African story, the African American as well as the African diaspora story. Just to give you some of the highlights of the amazing film, amazing talent that's coming from Africa. There's a musical film. It's a musical dance film from Ghana. It's called 1432. It's a fantastic story being told through the power of music. They use rap music, which is an American genre, but they are telling an African story using that. Another interesting story, Ewura Morak Alabi. This is a story that really captivated the audience here. It's a story that talks about the immigration, especially from East Africa, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. A lot of young people going through very dangerous routes to reach Europe or elsewhere. And it's a personal story of this young person who told the story. And there's many other stories that are interesting that the audience is really enjoying here in Dallas. Now, we can also, we've been talking to some of the filmmakers as well, and some of the filmmakers were telling us it's important that especially African youth, tell their own stories, and let's hear what they had to say.
You know, we went with the slogan, bridging cultures through films. Not only do we want to bridge the gap between Africa and other regions of the world, we also want to bridge the gap in Africa. Cultural groups, ethnic groups, geographical locations, North, East, South, West Africa. We want to bring the cultures together through film.
Let's stick to our story. Let's tell the story very well. Let's stick to, because we're great storytellers and that's what we're known for. Let's stick to our story. Let's stick to our originality. But at the same time, let's make them in a better way. Make them in a very, what I mean by in a better way, let's put in time into our production value. Let's step it up.
So Henok, tell us more about these films, especially the public's reaction to the different types of movie. What seemed to be more appealing?
Now, one very good story, well done, coming from Egypt. It's called Wintry Spring. It's a coming-of-age story of a single father whose daughter is going through puberty, and it's the struggle that they have to communicate with one another, each other's feelings. And there's so many stories, so many films that really depict the African story in day-to-day lives, how policies and politics affects them. Opening day, there was an interesting story coming from Nigeria. It's a story about the Niger Delta and some of the issues that came through the discovery of oil. It's called Olibri, and they kicked off with serious. At the same time also, there are so many fun, everyday life stories about, you know, a husband and a wife looking for children and the challenges that they face. So it ranges from the seriousness of the issues that are true today in Africa to everyday life, and they're trying to show the African story, the African narrative, tell it to the African diaspora as well as non-Africans who are coming here and enjoying the films. And that's what I was wondering in terms of the makeup of the public. Did you see more Africans attending the screenings, or did you see Americans there as well? We do have a big African diaspora community here in Dallas, Texas. We have, over the weekend, the Congolese were celebrating their independence. The Burundian community here, very strong. Ethiopian community here, very strong. They came in numbers. But in most of the screenings, we've seen a lot of people from Dallas who actually came to see some of these films. And there were actually two stories that came from Dallas, Texas, telling the African-American story, and it's just a fantastic event in that regard. Wonderful. And how many days do you have to watch more movies? Well, tonight is going to be the red carpet gala. I know, Lenore, you would love to be here for that, and it's going to be an award ceremony as well. Okay. It's beautiful. It's the 4th of July weekend. People are taking off, and it's just fantastic mood here. Enoch, enjoy your time there. Thank you so much for your report. And that was VOA's Enoch Fenton reporting live from Dallas, Texas. It's time now for a short break, still to come on Africa 54. Another day, another candle, and Kylie Jenner controversy. We'll be right back.
sir.
Welcome back to Africa 54. Here is what's trending. It may look like a golf cart, but this small four-wheeled cargo pod claims to be miles more than smart. Bubbling along London's cobbled streets, it's taking part in what's claimed to be the first ever autonomous grocery delivery trial in Britain. Cargo Pod uses software that performs real-time navigation, planning, and perception. How about that? While the small vehicle is driving itself, it's still being monitored by experts sitting on board who are able to step in case of any unforeseen emergencies. The autonomous delivery buggy is battery-powered and makes hardly any noise. It boasts 8 separate loading compartments and is able to transport a total of 128 kilograms of goods. Next up, a Russian man born without a hand has finally been given a robotic hand with which to pursue his lifelong passion for gun sports. Now, Anton Vlasov is discovering for the first time what it feels like to use his right hand. The growing availability of robotic prosthetics led Vlasov to search for an artificial limb which would enable him to live life fully, but they were too expensive. Buying a prosthetic from overseas would have cost him about $9,000. After searching for 10 years, he discovered a Russian startup called Motorika. At his request, the hand being made in army colors and includes special features which enable him to fire his air gun. And finally, Kendall and Kylie Jenner have apologized for vintage T-shirts superimposing their images with those of famous musicians, including Ozzy Osbourne, Tupac Shakur, and the Notorious B.I.G. The sisters began selling the shirts Wednesday online for $125 each. Sales of the shirts were halted, and the apology issued after Osbourne's wife, Sharon Osbourne, and Violeta Wallace, the mother of late Notorious B.I.G., complained. A statement later released by the sisters' brand says the designs were randomly selected and not well thought out. And that's what's trending today. Thanks for watching today's show. I'm Linor Moudou. See you next time.
Welcome to English in a Minute. A cannon used to be a common military weapon.
Loose cannon.
So, are Anna and Jonathan talking about an old battle?
Hey, I'm looking for someone to host a political event tomorrow night. Can your friend Sylvia help out?
Sylvia? She's a loose cannon. You never know what she's going to say. She could easily